Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And fair warning, there's a lot of pop on this list. Fair bit of experimental material as well, even some crossed over with the pop, but it's pretty pop heavy until near the very end. Also might likely wind up as controversial, as always. So let's get on the pulse. Alright, got 10 albums on the docket. Let's first talk about From Second in Command, Look at All of the Pretty Lights.
I'm tired of being tired, cause I've always been the runs. It's how my shit is wide.
Okay, we're starting off with two patrons on our docket here. I've covered Second in Command a couple of times now, both in my channel and on Instagram. He's now looking to embrace more of a melodic sensibility with a little more refinement. And given that he has some potential, I actually had expectations here, and I'm happy to say this is probably Second in Command's best work to date across the board, showing considerable improvements in production, delivery, and especially his melodic sensibility, where he's taking a lot more cues from the dreamier, more liquid and sedate cloud rap and acoustic bedroom pop scenes that have blown up over the past couple of years, along with a smattering of Brockhampton along the way. But actually a closer comparison might be to imagine if some of the Drain Gang rappers actually had some bars and technical skill beyond all the memes, and they were willing to get a shade more honest and away from all the deflective irony. Yeah, the production is less glossy and expensive sounding, but that adds to the more homegrown feel of the sound, and I prefer hearing the content take a leap forward anyway. And not only are Second in Command's hooks stronger than ever here, and the inclusion of Cosmo's throatier tones as support, they are always welcome, especially with the more melodic vibe on the album as a whole, but the writing as a whole also feels more self-assured and focused, splitting in between the obvious dreamy escapism and self-deprecating flexes from the very real sense of loneliness and numb anxiety that he is slowly working to overcome. You can also tell he's taken a step or two when it comes to some real legit maturity and growing up, and being a little more honest and fair with himself with slightly more level framing, and embracing his sexuality and gender has given him some more bars in his arsenal that he does use pretty effectively. That being said, while I do think this is easily Second in Command's most accessible work to date in this brand of lo-fi pop rap, i.e. I might recommend this to some people in, let's say, that Drain Gang camp, I do think the next steps have to come in production, structure, and delivery. The volume of some tracks is a little inconsistent song to song, the vocals can be a little bit thin and could be better placed in the mix or layered to amplify their impact and expressiveness. I really personally could do for more verses per song, even if it's absolutely an old head complaint in terms of song structure. And while the production feels less bare bones and a lot better balanced than it used to be, it also couldn't hurt to add a little bit more in terms of layers and diversity to build a sound with less obvious inspirations. Still, if you're into this sound, I can actually credibly recommend this, and the promise here feels a lot more evident, so very solid 6 out of 10. If what I described sounds like your thing, worth a shot. Give it a chance. Next up from Patricia Taxxon, Yes and. So this project is looking to go more towards glitch pop and IDM, and I'll admit I wasn't entirely sure where she would end up with this. Patricia Taxxon has touched on so many different facets of electronic music, this could literally go anywhere, but for once it actually does effectively match its intended focus. Jagged, clattering snares and chunky bass across jerky rhythms with some very obvious touches of square pusher, but also the fatter, warping synths of bro step that Taxxon has been exploring over the past couple of years, along with some keening, glassy twinkles that should be a little bit more familiar to those of her sound, and also remind me a little of Igloo Ghost in patches. Now, I will admit with the greater focus on jittery grooves and chirpy, high-frequency percussion, it's kind of further from the sounds I really like from her, but there's enough defined pop melodic moments that punch through regardless, like the staccato swagger of Shirley Nonetheless, and the more varied and slightly more textured percussion of No But that complements the subtle vocal touches, or the swells of fluttery beat shifts across Truly Granted, and the vibrant twinkling crescendos of Precisely After All that have a very Anna Meredith feel in their melodic richness, or how the liquid, glassy rumbles of Certainly Yet show a very obvious parallel to the late Sophie's brand of electronica, and that is absolutely intentional, and it takes us to the lyrics and themes of this project. Patricia Taxxon has described this project more as sound conversation, the exchange of artistic ideas, and while her plunderphonics work work has always highlighted just how much she will borrow or remix other people's ideas, this feels a little bit more like a tribute or showing a bit more give and take, trying to commune with the music of her peers and her inspirations, and then certainly yet processing her own grief at Sophie's passing, and then maybe even wishing for a similar form of a dreamlike escape. In summary, while I'm a little bit less of a fan of this brand of glitch pop in comparison with other sounds she's explored, I think I get the importance of this album to Patricia Taxxon, and her production is steadily getting a lot more refined and melodically rich, so light 7 out of 10. Pretty good, just not great for me. Next up from Reese Lansangan, Time Well Spent.
What is this feeling? How could it be? Oh, what is this feeling? What is this feeling? What is this feeling? How could it be? Oh.
Alright, we're going to the Philippines with this artist, primarily indie pop and folk. She put out her debut album in late 2015, a couple scattered EPs since, and I'll admit off that debut album I was skeptical, as it was exactly the sort of overly twee indie folk pop that for the past couple of weeks I've highlighted as being very underwhelming to cover if the writing or hooks didn't rise up. And you know what, to be fair, this is a little better than I was expecting, and that there are a few more outright pop songs and a couple interesting production tricks, but it also feels a little like a bait and switch when we get a shift back to the saccharine, polished, but utterly tepid coffee house indie folk pop that I was thoroughly sick of in the early 2010s, which absolutely does not have the momentum to sustain a project nearly an hour long. Now, granted, pacing is a major issue here, as the album sinks into minimalist ballad mode on its second proper song, and the ukulele comes out by pocket, and that doesn't even count some of the attempts at pop rock by the back half, like Thanks But No Thanks, that aren't convincing in the slightest. And even if Lansangan is a very sweet sounding singer, I'm not especially wowed by her range or her expressiveness or naturalistic charisma, and it absolutely carries over to the lyrics, which strip out a lot of distinctive details to go for smaller, more universal scenes of seeking love and peace and healing, all about the intimate moments where a lot of the simplicity really is the charm. But this album also falls into an odd space where it's not stripped down or raw enough to intensify that closeness, especially with so little unique detail, and it's hard not to feel like this album is playing for a lower common denominator of pop music to make up for the fact that the hooks are kind of underpowered and the presentation is both dated and really dime a dozen. I mean, this would have been fine soundtracking a CBS sitcom in 2006, and if she wants to be cute and reference that era, I mean, she's chasing this brand of bedroom pop intimacy, which you can occasionally get with some of the slight rough edges and the programmed drum machines, only slight though, and I get it, but it doesn't make it remotely interesting, especially at this length. I've heard too much of this before. Light 5 out of 10. By the end of the album, she might be wondering if it's all a little bit too much for people. I'm wondering if there's enough. Just saying. Next up from Dayglow, Harmony House.
Something that I wish I would've told you, but you just don't seem to want to do everything when you're close to me.
I'm honestly not sure what to say about acts like this. Wow, on the debut album, it sounded like the exact same sort of jangling bedroom pop that cribs so rampantly from an oversaturated genre with nothing in the writing, production, or especially the vocals to stand out for me. Now, I think any defenders of that debut would agree with all of that and say that the hooks are good enough to save it regardless, but at least for me, when it sounds this disengaged, you need to have a little bit more to stick out. And on this sophomore album, well, okay, our frontman said that with this album he wanted to embrace more of a vintage, lightweight 80s pop sound. Call back to an experience growing up with that era of music. Kinda odd, this kid was born in 1999, but I digress. But the bigger problem is very similar to that of that Lord Huron album. I know the sounds and the production and the grooves that he's trying to appropriate, but when he's not an interesting or distinctive vocalist or writer, or can bring anything close to the bombast or punch of the best of that era, and his falsetto is painful, it sounds like a surface imitation that misses a lot of the fine details that could even make the cheese or the easy listening of this era tolerable, especially for a bunch of us who have all those albums on vinyl already. Seriously, I'm not getting on board with this recent run of modern retro fetishism, especially given how many labels have all those old catalogs on streaming services already, we can just go hear the original article if you know where to look. And in between all the chintzy, soft focus but kind of oily new wave gloss on the keyboards that for no good reason keep sliding off key in a poor attempt at psychedelia, the obviously programmed and really gated drum machines, the infusion of just enough soft funk guitar and saxophone to complete the pastiche. Look, I gotta be real, I can't compare this to Huey Lewis or Whitney Houston or Lionel Richie or Michael McDonald or any of the sophistopop of the 80s. I can't even compare this to how much Nick Jonas was cribbing from that sound on his last album this year, because at least in those cases there were front people who could push this above the easy listening pablum that was forgotten from this era. 80s Chicago goes harder than this. The Cutting Crew go harder than this. Maybe it's also because I remember how a lot of this music became commercial and TV theme fodder in the 90s, and then a bunch of late 2000s and early 2010s hypnagogic pop and synthwave acts that often bend this sound in interesting ways. But I can't even say this is that. It feels like a pretty straightforward recreation of the sound. And once you get past the very bland frontman, a lot of the content does not help. Half it is trying to frame questions of how much can you really know? You gotta think and live beyond the screen, move on with your life. But the other half devolves into a lot of pleading, frequently insecure love songs that flip between empty professions of vulnerability and this weird capriciousness that doesn't feel nearly as mature as it's trying to be. So it winds up feeling immature, kind of shallow, and honestly a little pitiful as a result. The most I can give this album is Crying on the Dance Floor, courtesy of that sax solo. It is the best song here, but let's be real, it's kind of like Greta Van Fleet. When I have the original article, I have no incentive to listen to a pastiche that can't even deliver the adequate recreation. I didn't like what this was doing regardless. Light 4 to 10. Folks, go listen to the newest Tenet from Zero album instead. Way smoother, way catchier, way smarter than this. Next up from VOLA, Witness. So I may have gone on record a couple of times that djent has been mostly responsible for rendering a lot of modern prog metal a down-tuned, oversaturated slog the past 10 to 15 years. But that doesn't mean I'm not open to being proven wrong with an act that can actually write hooks or production that can convey actual groove and not a lot of empty, clanking, Meshuggah-esque riff patterns. And you know what, credit where it's due, VOLA did catch me a little off guard for having a fair bit more melody and song structure here, even if I had some serious questions about some of their lyrical meter and production, especially around the synths. Although things did get a fair bit more refined on their sophomore album, which was actually pretty decent. And onto this... okay, you can tell that bringing in an external producer certainly ramps up a lot of the heaviness and immediacy of a lot of this production, but taking in some of the other experiments has me really kind of divided on this album, like the incorporation of some increasingly thin drum machines and even a rap verse on These Black Claws that doesn't feel remotely necessary and doesn't fit the album at all. But okay, overcompressed mix that leaves the drums feeling kind of underpowered aside, going for stronger hooks could be a real asset for a modern prog metal band. But there are three big problems here. Firstly, it's not an album that has solved its issues with lyrical meter and poetry, which in certain moments get a very ESL feel, where I grasp the metaphors, I get where the songs are trying to go for, but they feel increasingly awkward in the execution. And secondly, when you realize that the majority of this album is paying witness to a lot of ugly back-and-forth conflicts within a relationship, it makes you seriously question how likable anyone really is here. And while that might be part of the point, it doesn't make it an especially pleasant or insightful listen. But then, number 3, coming back to those hooks themselves, I gotta say, this is where I discovered that their frontman's been heavily inspired in recent years by both Meshuggah and Porcupine Tree, which not only explains some of the softer, clean vocals, but also a lot of their melodic progression, showing parallels to that band's 2000s era. But I also gotta say, VOLA does not have the benefit of Steven Wilson's impressive melodic chops or his production that, even if it's not your thing in recent years, has both a lot more texture, subtlety, and dynamic sensibilities than a set of songs that seem to be trying for a lot more anthemic punch than they can credibly sell. Not saying that there aren't some moments that click, they are, mostly courtesy of some considerably better synth work and some legit melodic heaviness. I'm demos like Straight Lines and Napalm, the hook and the frenetic shudders in the groove of 24 Light Years, that was pretty solid, and Inside Your Fur was a remarkably good closer, but let's be real, this still has enough of those jittery, overmanaged djent elements that with its other issues just leaves me a lot more lukewarm than I'd like to be. Light 6 out of 10. Again, not even really my style of prog. I don't think it's bad though, so maybe worth a shot. Next up, from Sweet Trip, A Tiny House in Secret Speeches, Polar Equals.
We have all the time.
Well, someone's been on Rate Your Music recently. So, okay, a little background. Sweet Trip is a San Francisco group that caught some critical acclaim in the underground for their blend of dream pop, shoegaze, glitch pop, and IDM. And when I say underground, I mean it. They found whatever critical acclaim they got in the 2000s, and in an era where Pitchfork were tastemakers that could break bands, they never got covered by that level of mainstream press, which begs the question if this was just an underdiscovered gem or a super niche internet cult act, and honestly, it's somewhere along the middle. With the rise of hyperpop and certain very online stripes of production trying to hit the space between lonely, dreamy textures and thousands of flickers of synth and glassy distortion ripping it all apart. Also, wow, you can tell that early Arca and Purity Ring were cribbing notes from this. But I absolutely get Sweet Trip's initial influences and appeal. But like some of the hyperpop that it's preceded, it can be a little bit hit and miss for me. And I include their slightly more conventional shoegaze and dream pop on You Will Never Know in similar territory. But now with this project, 12 years later, why do I get the impression that I'm just not in on the joke here? In short, it feels like a lot more of a relaxed, gentle Sweet Trip album in the same vein of Velocity Design Comfort and smashing a lot of glitchy stutters of percussion against very sedate vocals, the occasionally interesting groove, and melodies that feel a bit of a blur like reverb guitars, synths that either drift blearily through the mix or pulsate to add some texture to the groove, and all too many phaser effects warping the mix to no end. I will say there are a few moments that seem to promise a little bit more shuddering bombast and theatricality with slightly more diverse compositional styles that might try to justify a runtime of nearly 70 minutes, from acoustic segments to corroded shoegaze, from fuzz guitar passages to more bombastic rock. And I know you're not really supposed to care that this album doesn't have much in the way of defined hooks or more of a lyrical theme beyond just unrequited love that blows through increasingly wild imagery. Just gotta let it all wash over you. But if you find all the textural blend jumbled or rambling or just not all that interesting, I mean, it's tasteful enough not to be a gimmick, but it's definitely close to it, you might wind up feeling a little bit underwhelmed, especially for this album's length. It definitely has the feel of a cult project in a genre blend, and there are places where I will understand the appeal, especially if you can really sink into this vibe, but again, I feel a little like I'm on the outside looking in with this one, even if I recognize the real glimmers of quality, so very light 7 out of 10. It's good, just likely not fully for me. I'm okay with that. Next up, from Japanese Breakfast, Jubilee. And on the topic of shoegaze and dream pop, I've been hearing a lot of buzz for this act for a couple of years now, especially as her approach to genres was a little bit more propulsive, but still maintained a lot of the atmosphere. I've been more reticent. The overpressive mastering of Psychopomp really kept me from getting into it, and I was never really wowed by any of the hooks, but the sophomore album was a little bit more refined by embracing a broader palette within synthpop, so I did have a little bit of hope for this, especially with all that critical acclaim that's been flooding in. And, okay, let me start by saying I get why so many people are excited for this. It's easily the band's most varied and colorful pop project to date. The production is considerably more refined and balanced. It sounds a lot better. They brought more producers and engineers into the room, and you can definitely tell. And while there's definitely more of a 80s throwback vibe to a lot of songs, it's certainly very sweet sounding, it's very approachable, provided you can get into Michelle Zauner's vocals. This was less of an issue when the production was rougher around the edges, and you wouldn't notice it as much in the more downbeat cuts. But when she goes for the more expressive, bouncy pop songs, it honestly got kind of distracting how flat she can sound on some of these notes. I don't normally criticize vocal technique, but with how tight and polished and refined a lot of the production and grooves became, the lack of refinement or control when she gets louder in the mix really took me out of a lot of songs. And that's not counting that chipmunking on the backing vocal experiment on Savage Good Boy. Now there's also the feeling that this album is kind of sonically unstructured, a little bit all over the place, even if the content is pretty thematically consistent in its yearning for unrequited love and that greater relationship connection, which leads to some nice metaphors like the remarkably sultry Posing in Bondage and the excellent closing track Posing for Cars. But this is an album that will bounce from hazy 70s singer-songwriter pomp and circumstance to a lot of flashy 80s new wave and sophistopop, and I know everyone loves Be Sweet, but again, the vocals on that hook just kill it for me. And while they're often very well arranged and produced, in looking for what would stand out from the core to distinguish these cuts from their inspirations, or even just a lot of 2010s indie pop, outside of the vocals, which I don't really like, I'm not hearing that much, especially when a fair few of these snippets feel as abbreviated as they do. This album feels surprisingly short for as many ideas as it crams in, especially considering the instrumental solos are uniformly great. Again, I absolutely get the appeal of this one. It's why it's getting a 7 out of 10. There are great moments, but man, it's uneven. A little bit more polish, that might get it there. Next up from the Veronicas, Godzilla.
Cause I can feel you in my blood, in my blood.
What is it with the requests for pop acts that had their moment in the mid-2010s and are only now managing to put together a proper comeback? Now, for those of you who remember my list of the top 10 best hit songs of 2009, you might actually remember that I actually stuck up for their one crossover hit, Untouched, but truth be told, I have a soft spot for the Veronicas regardless. Given that they're Australian, they usually are allowed a little bit more jagged grit and attitude into their pop rock formula, and while it rarely put them over the top, it was generally solid for what it was. And then that scene fizzled out by the end of the decade just as they put out a surprisingly solid pivot to electro rock. Then they hit some snags with their labels. They mustered a pop pivot in 2014 that was way better than it had any right to be, but didn't have a lot of legs. And now in 2021, well, if you want a pop album that sounds like it's been recorded piecemeal for the past 6 years with little in the way of a coherent direction, it would be this. Seriously, In My Blood and The Only High, they are both here, and placed alongside the title track, you can almost track which pop trends the Veronicas were trying to ride at various points of their recording process. And what's kind of frustrating is that they're rarely bad at any of them. Part of this is the fact that the Veronicas are still very expressive singers, even as they claw through all the pitch correction and all the filters. I'm still a little bit shocked they don't do more with the duo playing off of each other, but the larger factor is that even as the styles shift from EDM to trap pop to late 2000s electro rock that they honestly should have embraced more often, even if it is a flagrant Kesha retread, it would be cool for that to come back, but there is still a rough consistency to the production quality. Now, the sequencing, throwing them all out of chronological order, makes the album feel pretty damn messy, but it's rarely boring, mostly helped along by the Veronicas being willing to embrace a fair bit more rough edge in their best of moments. And you know, even if this album is pretty damn basic when it comes to a lot of the lyrics and content. I mentioned this when I reviewed the title track on TikTok, but its destructive angst is probably the most depth we get, alongside of the reckless love songs of In My Blood and Stealing Cars, or maybe even some of the jaded nostalgia of Arcade, but at least there's a little bit more sleek flair and stylism that's trying to lean into it a little bit more, and they can convincingly sell it. Granted, that's also placed alongside some symphonic ballads like Kaleidoscope and Catch Fire that might be a little too overproduced and melodramatic for some people to embrace, and Sugar Daddy is such a clunky dud to end the album, easily the worst song here. But I think my larger issue is that while there are a few good songs, there's no truly great ones. And considering the Veronicas are looking to release a second album later this June, mostly produced by the same guy who did Sugar Daddy, I'm just expecting an oversaturation of middling material rather than one focused project, which is what you normally encounter with double albums, and presuming you can have wrung out of any focus of this jumble of styles. And thus for me, solid 6 out of 10, probably will satiate fans. I was hoping for a little more here. No idea why. Next up from Black Midi, Cavalcade.
Yes, this is a scene on Main Street when John 50 comes to town.
The funny thing is when Black Midi broke out in mid-2019, it was a sort of experimental rock that just felt like a sea change. A roiling, instantly mimetic fusion of post-punk, post-hardcore, and a half dozen other genres, with the brains and brawn to be really damn captivating. And even if Schlagenheim wasn't an album that I returned to frequently, I've mentioned this before, certain stripes of music in this lane doesn't always have the emotive sticking power to pull me back incessantly. It was a great enough debut. I really wanted to hear how the hell they would follow it all up, and okay, let me put it like this. This is an album that is just as smart as Schlagenheim, but it's more restrained, less mimetic, and maybe a little less interesting for the trouble. Even if I do think it's pretty damn good as a result. Part of this is just more acts alongside them in this lane for comparison, but Black Midi's themes and continuing meta-narrative place this once again in even less emotionally charged, but very cerebral territory, this time with more of a focus on degeneration and breakdown and decay. More about the process than the results. Authoritarians are overthrown, muscles and bone degenerate, where the wait for full collapse becomes more agonizing than the actual moment. And like with the last album, there is some nuance in the framing here, in both highlighting an admiration for those who will succeed despite all of that decay, where it might have come for all of the wrong reasons, and to the fact that once everything has collapsed under all this pressure, there's not really much of a clear direction of where the hell you're all gonna go next. It's the arc of deconstruction in hitting that brick wall, toppling it over, and then maybe becoming stronger for it, and then asking, alright, what now? Especially when you know that you could easily resort to the same sort of kitsch and the obvious ascending fourths to please the masses, even if it would feel so hollow. And you know what? Props to Black Midi for continuing their deconstructive arc further than I would have expected over 2 albums. Shame the actual execution of the sound feels a bit underwhelming for me. Look, as someone who really loves it when artists get meta like this, I know a big part of it is finding the human roots of a lot of that commentary, and Black Midi's approach to it is less feral this time around. A lot more clinical, kind of theatrical, but also dejected, and it makes the project less vibrant as a result, even if it can feel just as organically chaotic in spots. I think a big part of it are the more reserved vocals from Georgie Greep and Cameron Picton, but when you swap out guitars for more delicate strings and horns, go for the jazzy side, even if the arrangement remains wild and the dynamics are remarkably solid, seriously, the sound makes terrific use of negative space in order to ramp up the more unstable moments, I'm left thinking that this is an album that could have gone off just a little bit harder, or could have used some of those softer moments to add a bit more tune, or maybe a little bit more flash to the cyclical jazz progressions. Look, I don't know. I said at the very beginning, this was a subgenre of music that I can often find myself appreciating intellectually more than outright loving. And while their first album had both elements in spades, I think this is an album I respect more than I like. Solid 7 out of 10, certainly very good. I'm just a little disappointed it didn't grab me more. Not mincing words. And finally, from Rise Against, Nowhere Generation. You know, at some point, Rise Against became more of an institution as elder statesman and mainstream punk. And while I've liked a fair bit of what they released, from the lead-off single to this, I was also fairly certain I knew what I would get from a band that's comfortably years away from their peak. Even if they are one of the few acts that remain earnest enough in punk to keep on trying, at least they got rid of Nick Raskulinecz on production, hopped over to Loma Vista, going independent for the first time since 2003, and they brought back all the team that had worked on the Black Market, and that's an album I really like in comparison with a lot of people, so I did have some hopes here, and what we got is actually a pretty great late period Rise Against album, and I'll admit, I was kinda shocked by how much this actually really worked for me, because it's really just continuing in the wake of territory that they had built up in 2014, but then ramping up their melodic impulses and gradually adding a little more dimension to their writing, but this time there's a sense of urgency and firepower, a little bit more on the hardcore side that maybe going independent has finally given Rise Against the freedom to cut loose, with some faster tempos, a better balanced mix that ignores any sense of trend chasing, to finally give those terrific bass lines a lot more pulsating presence, and also some more openly political subject matter. Maybe he's just appreciating a punk band that's not openly nihilistic for a change, and actually wants to drive towards some tangible change, but can be both realistic in the struggles and also showcase some revolutionary hope. But I'd also argue lyrically, Rise Against are more targeting at inspiring people. It's trying to win both hearts as well as minds, and I love that it's not cynical, even though Rise Against would have every reason to be coming out of the major label system. Coupled with the sense of populism that's always been this band's greatest strength, and writing that is thankfully getting a little bit smarter and a bit more specific, from the pro-democracy charge of the numbers, hitting at one's own personal self-doubt, living in bad systems, on talking to ourselves as we want to do better, seizing self-respect outside of the capitalistic framework on Monarch, and that shifts into the environmentalist sooner or later. Look folks, this is the stuff I love in great political art. Even if you could make the point that Rise Against are better at sloganeering than being specific, when the slogans and anthems are this good, I'm not complaining. Couple that with the wispy but impactful folk punk reassurance of Forfeit, the galloping heaviness of Sounds Like, the fact that even in its weaker moments, the album is still desperately trying to inspire you with every backing vocal whoop, it becomes one of those projects that's hard for me to really dislike. It might not have a People Live Here, but it's more varied, aggressive, and legit impactful than Rise Against has been in years. Arguably decades. And considering how it'd be so easy to call an act like Rise Against corny or irrelevant in the face of the new school of punk and that next generation of irony, I appreciate that they've kept trying, they've kept growing, and they delivered a great album along the way that might be their most hardcore in years. 8 out of 10, at least one of the old guard can still hold that banner. Gotta respect that. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Man, it's nice to end things on a high note. That's really reassuring. Although, hey, if you guys, I'm sure, take issue with something that I've said in this review, comments are down there. Have fun. Beyond that, if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get albums on my schedule or potentially talk to me directly on Discord, link to my Patreon is right over there. Please do not feel obligated at this time. Again, tough times out there for everyone. I get it. I'll be fine. But if you want to, options available. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.